De aquella viene la revolución, para que se asustan será pa' mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, ¡viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito, nada.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 25, Unmasking Imperialism, exposing imperialist propaganda in mainstream media. Today, we're talking about Afghanistan, the so-called withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan, the Zionist push for permanent occupation of South Asia and the Middle East, the Islamic world, and Afghan relations with Russia, China, and Iran. The withdrawal deadline is coming up August 31st, just a few weeks away. And we have none other than our good friend, Mohsin Abbas, independent TV journalist, broadcaster, and current affairs analyst based in the UK. How's it going, brother Mohsin?
It's cool. Lovely to be back with you, Ramiro.
Good. It's good to talk with you. And I wanted to bring you on because something that's in the news recently is the Afghanistan pullout, the so-called withdrawal. We know as anti-imperialist activists, as speakers, that it's not really a withdrawal. We know that U.S. security forces are still occupying the region in the private sector. There's tons of military-industrial complex organizations from the U.S. that are still going to be operating there with private security firms. So even though formally the U.S. armed forces are pulling out, the U.S. military-industrial complex is remaining. And in fact, it's probably growing in Afghanistan. So I think it's important to mention that. But I wanted to get you on to talk a little bit about the impact of the U.S. occupation in Afghanistan for 20 years now, since 2001. We're approaching the 20th anniversary. And also, I wanted to talk about one entity in the Middle East that is not really spoken about whenever we're talking about Afghanistan. One entity that has benefited tremendously from endless U.S. wars and occupation in the region, that is heavily invested in wars and imperialism and financing occupation of the region, which is the quote-unquote state of Israel, which also is carrying out an occupation on Palestinian land, on occupied Palestine, and is trying to start a new war with Iran, trying to start a new war with the resistance forces in Iraq and Lebanon. And Israel isn't really mentioned whenever we're talking about Afghanistan. But what's interesting is that as I was researching and reading about those who oppose the withdrawal of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, there were a lot of similarities in the people who were opposing the withdrawal. A lot of the commentators who were neocons or even quote unquote liberal Democrats who spoke out against Biden pulling out, a lot of them are hardcore supporters of Israel, of Zionism, of the occupation of Palestinian land. And I find that really fascinating because there are a lot of parallels there in terms of their need for endless war, their need for endless occupation of lands that belong to people who have been there for thousands of years. And so I just wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on the so-called withdrawal and the role of Israel? How is Israel viewing all of this?
Yeah, it's a fascinating angle that you're coming at it from. Very few people want to, I think, touch this issue of Israel and its impact beyond the Middle East, because, of course, technically Afghanistan is really part of effectively South Asia in a way. Really, it's kind of on that border between India, Pakistan, and then, of course, into Iran and the Western Asia proper, if you like. So often it gets neglected as a region which might be of interest to Israel. The bottom line is this, that Israeli, Indian, American interest within Afghanistan is absolutely crucially and integrally part of the foreign policies of each one of those players. Of course, when I talk about America, I'm really talking about Anglo-Zionist empire, which includes the British and NATO and whoever else is in that cartel, if you like, that sort of imperialist cartel. So Israel, what connection might it have? Well, first of all, consider this, that Afghanistan has a thousands-mile-long border with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Islamic Republic of Iran is enemy number one of the Israelis, according to Mossad, according to the Israeli Defense Force, according to Israeli successive prime ministers. So there's no way that Israel is not going to be looking at Afghanistan as a crucial player within its geopolitical game. First of all, they needed Afghanistan in order to put pressure on Iran on its eastern borders, and they have done that. I'll go into how over the time we have. Also, of course, Israel is very concerned about one major issue in that region, and it is nuclear weapons. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. It is the only Islamic nation to have nuclear weapons. Pakistan has a huge standing army. It has a very efficient army by all accounts, and it has nuclear weapons. It's also, on paper at least, officially unrecognizing of Israel, and in fact very stoically against Israel and the Zionist state. Both nations were formed or came into being in the same year, 1947, and they've been diametrically opposed. People don't know also that Pakistani Air Force has the only pilots who've ever taken down an Israeli jet fighter or three in open dogfights and wars. They did this, I think, in the 67 war, in which Israel lost. The only fighters I believe it's ever lost in aerial battles is to Pakistan and Pakistani Air Force. So there has been a history, and there is a history of Israel keeping a very watchful eye on Pakistan. Now, Pakistan is arguably the major foreign player after the Americans in Afghanistan. On the one hand, Afghanistan was, if you like, intruded upon primarily because of General Zia and his acceptance of the role as trainer in chief and military supplier in chief of the Afghan Mujahideen to drive out Russia from Afghanistan back in the previous century, which he did successfully, which Pakistan did successfully, which the Afghan Mujahideen did successfully, and it formed the basis of a lot of what is still happening in Afghanistan and the great game, as it were, that is still being played out. Of course, Pakistan was given this role of driving out the Russians from Afghanistan, and it built very strong relationships with the Afghans on the ground, the Mujahideen, the fighters. It's that relationship which arguably has been the bedrock of the rise of the Taliban as the major, if you like, military force or power in Afghanistan outside of whatever the Americans back. But it's been a very complicated relationship ever since that Mujahideen situation, because, of course, we had the 9/11 scenario in which, George Bush and company managed to get all of their geopolitical bearings wrong, because they blamed Afghanistan for 9/11, and when actually all of the so-called perpetrators of that act were Saudi Arabians, they're Saudi Arabian citizens. Yet we had the excuse of going to chase bin Laden in Afghanistan. Apparently he was in the mountains of Afghanistan. It gave the pretext for the Americans to go into Afghanistan again under a different guise. The guise was to capture terrorists. That was the narrative that was sold to the American people, and on the back of that, billions and billions of dollars have been poured into this wasted war, which essentially the Americans have now lost. They failed to achieve more or less any of their objectives, arguably on the surface. But I was trying to tie this very complicated nexus. People are going to begin to now recognize just how complicated and just how many forces and powers and international powers and regional powers are vested in terms of stakeholdership within an Afghanistan of some form, which is, favorable to their interests. You have the Russians, of course, who I mentioned, who are still very much on the borders of Afghanistan, still keeping a very watchful eye. They have the Tajikistanis on the borders. They have their old Central Asian republics, which are essentially trained militarily by Russia and are very nervous about whatever happens in Afghanistan, because we know that now the situation, whilst the American forces have abruptly pulled out of Bagram and have only apparently around about 650, I don't know, 650 or 900, something like that, in terms of the official troops they have on the ground. You rightly mentioned that isn't the reality. The reality is contractors, special operations teams, undercover surveillance outfits, espionage networks, and most importantly, ISIS. American proxy group ISIS have been ferried in, transported in, flown in. Russian intelligence has confirmed this. Iranian intelligence has confirmed this, that what we're getting is unmarked helicopters that have been flying in ISIS fighters from Syria, from Iraq, after their kind of their losses there. And the Americans have done hunky-dory deals to get these kind of mercenaries into Afghanistan. So you can see what's happening is that there is a pressure cooker and a boiling pot. The Pakistanis and the Taliban are, of course, the major player now. They've taken over 190 of the provinces or regional provinces that would be recognized. They're rapidly advancing. They haven't taken any of the major cities yet, but certainly most of Afghanistan now is controlled by them. All the checkpoints coming in and out of the country are controlled by the Taliban. The Taliban are strongly backed by Pakistan. Pakistan has trained, has nurtured, has supported them, and continues to do so. And what we're seeing is a Taliban, I believe, which is not the same Taliban which first emerged all those many years ago. There are fundamental differences in the way this Taliban operates, and we'll go into that later. America primary interests were to dominate and control Afghanistan for the poppy trade, for the heroin trade that would exit from there. Their other major reason was to obviously prevent Pakistan from having a major control, or Islamic Republic of Iran, or the Russians to have an out-and-out, if you like, relationship or control of Afghanistan. So this is what's been really going on. The Americans' thing is minerals. Afghanistan has over $25 trillion worth of estimated minerals and resources locked away. Very hard to get at, but nonetheless, they're there. It's a very wealthy country, actually, although impoverished due to war and lack of development. but it also has the immediate poppy trade, and the Americans have been facilitating a huge increase in the smuggling of heroin and poppy trade, the poppy out of Afghanistan via Pakistan. That was one of the big trade things that was going off. They also do it from Bagram Airport. That was a major reason, and the finances that came from that run into really the multi-billions, if not the trillions. That's how big that trade was. So this, I hope, gives you a little bit of the overview of what could be happening. And your question about Israel, all of it, Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan itself is vital to Israel in terms of destabilizing the region, just as vital as it is to destabilize Iraq and to destabilize the neighboring nations. I believe they have a strong interest in continuing to balkanize Afghanistan. And if America can't control it outright, their next stage will be for the Israelis and the Americans to use ISIS and other disruptive mercenary outfits to continue to bomb and maim and kill and terrorize the Afghan population, perhaps even to try and overthrow the Taliban or whoever comes into power if they don't listen to Zio-American policies in that region.
That's such a great breakdown. I'm glad you mentioned opioids and heroin. Where I'm speaking to you now from the US, I'm not sure if it's the same situation in the UK, but within the last 20 years, there has been a huge opioid epidemic in the United States that has almost been on par with the US occupation of Afghanistan. And for those of you who are listening, we're looking at a chart of overdose death rates by opioids in the US that, starting from the year 2000, 2001, after the US occupation of Afghanistan, were home to a lot of opium and poppy, where the US imperialist forces have occupied that region, has significantly gone up. And so when I point this out, people think I'm crazy sometimes. People are like, oh my God. But I feel like, in my opinion, a big part of it is controlling the drug trade. Because not only do the big pharmaceutical companies that are trying to convince us to get a certain thing inserted into us, I'm not going to say the word because we'll probably get shut down, but a lot of those pharmaceutical companies also are the ones who invested into war and are invested into the military-industrial complex that profit from drugging people in deindustrialized cities in the US, but also, going back to the map that we were talking about with Afghanistan, I think you pointed out something very important, is the fact that Afghanistan, many have compared it to being the centerpiece of the chessboard, where you have Iran, that huge border with Iran. And to my understanding, in eastern Iran, the Iranian government has had to step up efforts to try to stop drug smuggling, heroin smuggling into its eastern border. Afghanistan also borders Western China, the Xinjiang region, where certain US-aligned elements want to foment a new war in China. So and then Pakistan, which has moved more in the anti-imperialist camp and has moved more in an independent path. So Afghanistan is perfectly centered for US-Israeli interests, the UK interest, and it's so important for them. And that's why I think that Afghanistan historically has played such an important role, especially the rare earth minerals that we're talking about, the drug trade. And it really reminds me of the sort of opium wars that we saw in the 1800s, where the UK, where you're speaking to us from now, basically grew opium and heroin in India and Pakistan, and then forced the Chinese to import it. It drugged their whole population to force them to take this drug, and subjugated the people so that they can impose their Anglo-Zionist mercantile system. So it's just crazy to see the levels of evil. Like, that's the only way I can describe it,
Yeah, the reality is that just looking at your map, it does give people a clearer idea of just how influential it is. Just look at how many of those nations border it, and all of the major nuclear powers, whether China, you count China, Russia, India, Pakistan, and now Iran, very likely as well to be a nuclear power. They're all bordering there, and of course the Americans are in there as well. Now, the thing I'm going to pick up on though is this other factor that I didn't mention. China has the Belt Road Initiative, which it's clearly rolling out with great success in all the neighbors around Afghanistan. Only Afghanistan is currently missing out on the action, if you like. But you can see how lucrative it could be for Afghanistan if they bought into this. Now, the Taliban have just visited China. They've visited Russia. They've been holding talks in Iran as well with Jawad Zarif. It's interesting how the three major nations that have not really been directly involved in Afghan developments internally for quite some time are now being courted by the Taliban. This is not the Taliban that we know from the old days, which was very much about perhaps, it was, well, the way it was portrayed in the West was all about its kind of religious draconian, persona and image. And that's what was used to say how bad they were. But the reality is that the Taliban stopped the drug trade. They ground it virtually to a halt during the period when they were in power. They also now are very much in terms of thinking in terms of regional outreach to China and Russia and Iran and others as trade partners, as people who, as nations that they could work with, as a region where they could prosper. I think that narrative of prosperity, of peace, and of economic collaboration is a far more powerful one and a more attractive one to the Taliban if they're going to be a long-term, if you like, political player in either Afghanistan or beyond. If they don't go that direction, they know also full well that ultimately, if Americans have withdrawn to whatever extent, it's very possible that the Russians and the Chinese and the and the Iranians and others could also gang up on them and create problems for them. Because, of course, Western Afghanistan is Dari speaking, very Persian or Iranian culturally influenced fraternity. The north of Afghanistan, where of course Shah Massoud and his forces were very, very prominent in the resistance against Russia at one time, and then were ousted and put back by the Taliban in a way. All of these forces could work against the Taliban if they really desired, and if they were given, for instance, military or economic aid from the outside by these growing superpowers, or if what I like to call the Eurasian axis, if like China, Iran, and Russia, and Pakistan as well. There could be huge problems. I don't think the Taliban are interested in belligerence or being kind of like an Afghanistani emirate of the kind that, say, ISIS were. And I think we've got to make this distinction. The Taliban are not ISIS. They are not Al-Qaeda. Yes, they may have ideologically quite conservative viewpoints, but they are not that. They are not terror forces that are mercenaries operating for the Zio-Western imperialist empire. So the Chinese are very interested in the Taliban and have launched a statement this week saying that they're very keen on developing fraternal relationships and developing, economic relationships with Afghans, and they want the Taliban to be an integral part of any future government, and are very happy to accept that. The Russians are in the same boat. They're very much about dialogue and about rapprochement and about sort of national conciliation. The puppets of the Americans, of course, Mr. Ghani and the current incumbents, are not so straightforward. They're clearly fighting for their own space, and the kind of so-called democracy which the Americans have been nurturing is actually much more of a plutocracy and a very autocratic one as well, because Mr. Ghani and company are not really into the idea of sharing power. They've been brought to this point by the power of the Taliban resistance and the effectiveness of their fight back against the Zio imperialist occupation of Afghanistan. That's basically what it's been. And these proxies now are being forced to come to reality. The game isn't over. As you rightly say, I think that the Americans are deleting their own visible forces to make it look like they've gone. But I think they've left in place all the apparatus to cause huge conflict and terror. And it now remains to be seen how effective the ISIS forces, the other mercenaries, the other people who've got a vested interest in maintaining neoliberalism in Afghanistan and that sort of range, how actual powerful they are and how effective they are. We're in a position where civil war could be on the cards, because if the Americans do back these forces in a way that continues the conflict, then we could see a yet more protracted bloodshed and war internally amongst Afghans because of this use of certain people within that country as proxies.
That's a great point. And shout out to everybody who's watching and listening. Leslie said Al-Qaeda was created and funded by the CIA. And a good point about making the distinction between Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And I think people in the West just have, honestly, and including myself, I'm still learning a lot about the region, have no idea about the intricacies of South Asia and the Middle East. I've met people who believe that Iran is worse than Saudi Arabia. Like, a lot of the people in the West believe that everything they say about Saudi Arabia is about Iran. And so there's so much education, including myself. I include myself in this, that we in the West have to do about South Asia, the Middle East, the Islamic world, because things have changed. And I think people are kind of still stuck in looking at things in the 1990s, early 2000s. But I want to play a clip for you. There's this guy named Bill Kristol. I find this guy really fascinating. So Bill Kristol is a Republican, a neocon. He is the son of Irving Kristol, who is a Trotskyite from a group called the New York Intellectuals. This was obviously within the socialist movement, the Trotskyist anti-Soviet camp that was pro-Zionist, that was in favor of the state of Israel and broke with a lot of the communists, because a lot of the communists didn't support Israel. The Trotskyites did support Israel. And there is this concept called the Trotskyite to neocon pipeline, where you have other people in the New York Intellectuals, other former Trotskyists. Also, the president of the National Endowment for Democracy was also a Trotskyist and became a neocon. So Irving Kristol was like the father of the Trotskyism to neocon pipeline. His son, Bill Kristol, served in office, I think, for George Bush, and he's a Republican neocon. So he has this podcast where he talks about current events and politics, and he speaks with this other guy named Eric Edelman, who is a member of the Jewish Institute for National Security, another Zionist outfit. He was the Secretary of Defense under George Bush. So both of these two pro-Israel Zionists talk about how abandoning Afghanistan was a mistake, how it's horrible. So I want to play a clip from that conversation and just get your reaction, because this is what these Zionist types are talking about, that this is horrible. So I'll just play a little bit of this.
People like me were critical. I was supported the surge. I remember being invited to the White House in a bipartisan meeting with the president, where I think he was a little nervous to see people like me supporting it, and he had his own doubts about it. It wasn't kind of what he wanted to do, but I think to his credit, he did what he thought was the right thing for the country. And for all the time limiting of it, which I think was a mistake, and the subsequent difficulties, which God knows there have been plenty of. And I mean, the truth is, if you had told us, correct me if I'm wrong, in 2009-10, that in 2020-21, we would have the situation we have in Afghanistan, which is, or we had until, let's say, 6 months ago, a messy situation, not great. A lot of Taliban hasn't gone away. They don't have perfect control. The government's not free of corruption, et cetera. But basically, limited violence, very little engagement on the part of U.S. troops, a pretty successful drawdown. People like us might have said maybe too much drawdown, but a pretty successful drawdown to a few thousand troops, not mostly, thankfully, engaged in combat, or certainly not taking fatalities when they, the kind of combat they were engaged in. I think one would have said, you know what, that's not a bad, I mean, I hate to, this is so contrary, and I'm almost scared to say this, but this was not such a bad decade, right? I mean, if you look, sort of step back and say, as a matter of foreign policy, you kept a country that had been the seedbed of terror directed against us and others from being such a thing. You had kept reasonable stability in the region when everyone was very worried about Pakistan and other places 10 years ago. We'll come back to that going forward. And the way in which everyone just regards the war as a ridiculous, hopeless enterprise, they forgot that it was the good war. They forgot that it was not unsuccessful, the things we did there to some degree. And now, and I guess President Obama's inclination to want to get out, though he never quite did, and President Trump's repeated attempts to get out, somehow 10 years of that has just convinced a pretty good chunk of the American people and laid the groundwork, I guess, for incoming President Biden to just say enough.
Look, this has been a very frustrating, 20-year experience for Americans. H.R. McMaster, who served out in Afghanistan, and of course was President Trump's second national security advisor, has said, and I think there's some merit in this, that it wasn't really a 20-year war. It was, 21-year wars, because we, changed approaches, changed commanders, rotated forces. And there's a lot of lessons that, appropriately need to be drawn, eventually from this experience. But, there were, a lot of successes, both in terms of, recreating an education system, getting Afghans back to school, particularly girls and women. Great gains for women's rights. The corruption, of course, has been a persistent problem and very frustrating one for Americans to deal with. I mean, we contributed to that because of the flood of international assistance money that came into Afghanistan, which distorted the economy and created a lot of perverse incentives. So it's been a long, frustrating process. But as you, I think, rightly suggest, first, President Obama, to his credit, did not carry through on his undertaking to withdraw all U.S. forces before he left. There was persistent pressure from folks in the Pentagon in particular to make withdrawals conditions-based. President Trump came in and wanted to get out again, just as President Obama had wanted to do. And he was to some degree thwarted again by the Pentagon, by H.R. McMaster and others who wanted to make sure that we didn't leave with our tail between our legs, and that we didn't accept a defeat in Afghanistan. And we had kind of come to an outcome that wasn't terribly satisfactory from a lot of points of view, but which was tolerable, which was the presence of about 3,000, 3,500 troops, not in combat, as you said, mostly providing support and enablement for the Afghan security forces to be able to carry out the military tasks. The Afghans were bearing the brunt of the fighting. U.S. casualties were almost non-existent or very, very low. I think 4 killed, in the year before President Trump started this process of withdrawal. And I think, this is going to be seen in retrospect, I fear, as, a self-inflicted, unforced error on the part of the United States. Now, to be fair to the Biden administration, it was President Trump who decided to first negotiate an agreement with the Taliban, and then to not only agree to withdraw by May 1st of this year, but actually to try and accelerate that withdrawal. He was trying to get it done before he left office. And that, of course, got subsumed in the post-election issues of him trying to stay in.
So that's part of their conversation. So much nonsense in that discussion, but it's crazy to see how they talk. Just before I pass it on to you, Mohsin, Bill Kristol, again, the son of Irving Kristol, the Trotskyite Zionist from New York. He described the occupation of Afghanistan as, quote, the good war. He said it was not unsuccessful, the things that we did there, even though tens of thousands of Afghanis were murdered, innocent people. And Eric Edelman, another Zionist, said U.S. casualties were almost non-existent. Never mentioned once all the Afghanis who were killed, right? It's as long as the U.S. casualty, there are no U.S. casualties, then it's fine. And Eric Edelman also said there were a lot of successes. And he even used the term women's rights, which I thought that was really interesting, which maybe we can get into that, the Western imperialist understanding of women's liberation, and also praising the flood of international financial assistance, aka neoliberalism. So just so many levels of spells and wizardry and Zionism in what they're talking about. Your reaction to this is the dominant neocon Zionist narrative. Your reaction to that?
Yes, it's kind of mind-boggling just how they can spin such a major disaster and try to make it still seem like it's okay. Well, let's get some facts on the ground first. Firstly, all told, the cost of nearly 18 years plus of war, it'll amount to about $2 trillion for the US. Let me say that again. $2 trillion. The US is about $28 trillion in debt overall. And if you think about it, 2 trillion just in Afghanistan. This is something which the American citizen is going to foot the bill for. This debt ultimately lands on the desk of the folks who live on the ground. What did they get out of it? Well, and was it money well spent, as they seem to be indicating? They want to sort of say they had some sort of bargain basement going on there. Well, there's little to show for it in reality. The Taliban still control much of the country and are now looking like they'll actually pretty much dominate anything that emerges in Afghanistan. It remains one of the largest sources of refugees and migrants. So if they were going to do anything for Afghanistan, they certainly didn't help all the displaced people. You only need to ask Pakistan, Iran, and other neighbors, Tajikistan, etc., just how bad that refugee situation is, and that's likely to get worse given the warfare that's going on now. So they didn't do any favors to the Afghanis there. The absolute lie is that there was no damage to American troops. Well, ask the families of the 2,400 American soldiers that were killed in action one way or another whether they think it was worth it, and ask all those American veterans who are suffering from PTSD and other mental health issues, left wallowing in their misery for the rest of their lives, whether it was worth it. I think that you will find a very, very different answer from the kind of nasty neocon fraternity that we were having to pay attention to. And of course, let's not count the 38,000 Afghan civilians, which the Americans have blessed with death and misery for the hundreds of thousands and millions of relatives and community members that knew every one of those 38,000 Afghan civilians. These are not fighters. This is civilians. The fighters, is estimated over 26 to 27,000 Taliban were killed. What did it achieve? At the end of the day, the Americans built up a debt. Arguably, if there was a heroin trade and they did make money out of that, that certainly didn't come to the American taxpayer. Or if it did, then of course the American taxpayer would have to ask, why on earth are we profiting from the illegal gains of a drug mafia trade? And since when has American citizenry sanctioned its government to being a drug dealer? 90% of the heroin in the world today comes through Afghanistan, and it's under the watch of the American, if you like, occupation there that has happened. This is something they can't get away from. So not only they profited from these ill-gotten gains, they've actually destroyed Western society in itself, because most of those kids that are lying around in the city centers of Los Angeles or New York or anywhere up and down America or Europe, you can bet your bottom dollar that they got that heroin from an American military force, which has facilitated and serviced the corporate mafias which have been carrying out this trade. So it's been a win-win for certain corporate forces, dark forces, and openly as well, in terms of the contracts that they won to carry out this military atrocity in Afghanistan. Certainly, there have been many people who have profited from that. Many military agencies and corporations like Lockheed Martin or Boeing and such like forces. If you go and look at who's been supplying the weapons, there's been a lot of people who've made a lot of money, not only out of the American public, but also out of private funding and, of course, the loot from Afghanistan. So I would say that this $2 trillion war that's been waged has been far from beneficial for anybody except for those structural elite, those mafias, those moneylender mafias, and indeed I would say the Zionist networks, which have been probably siphoning off a lot of the money that's been made out of this detestable, diabolical war, and they've been then using it to fill up their own accounts in tax havens around the world, or financing Israel and other illegal entities to carry out more murder, mayhem, and control of society.
That's such a great point. And even also Ryan Preston had a great comment. He said, and that's only the direct killed by weapons numbers, not the true casualty count. So it's a lowball estimate. So the number of Afghanis killed, it can be so much higher. And it's just crazy because we never hear about that, right? We know that a lot of people have died, but we'll never know the true amount of innocent Afghanis who've been killed. And the PTSD is cross-border because the same way that me and my girlfriend were watching a documentary the other day about drones and the psychological impact that drones have had on Afghan children. And so many Afghan children have PTSD because every time they hear a drone or anything that resembles a drone, they think it's going to bomb them. And it reminds me of what's happening in Gaza as well, where you have the Zionists who sell drones to US forces to bomb innocent people in Afghanistan. Those same drones are being used to bomb Palestinian children in Gaza. And so you have PTSD on that side. And then conversely, you have PTSD for US soldiers who return to the US coming back from Afghanistan, who are overdosing on the same drugs that they were sent to guard in Afghanistan to begin with. So just the levels of PTSD and trauma are insane. And I wanted to read some of this article. This is from the New York Times. This is an op-ed by another guy named Brett Stevens, also a Zionist supporter. If you look at his history and background, he's somebody who has defended Israel and is part of this Zionist media control as well. He had this op-ed in the New York Times: abandoning Afghanistan is a historic mistake. Leaving proves Osama bin Laden right. Eventually, America cuts and runs. So it's a very disgusting article. I just want to read some of it because, again, this is what we're getting in mainstream media, and touching back on this topic of maybe we can get into after reading this article about how the U.S. uses women's rights or bourgeois conception of women's rights. So he says, I once boarded a flight from Dubai to Kabul alongside a team of Afghan soccer players, teenage girls in red uniforms, chatting and laughing much as they might have anywhere else in the world. I thought of those players again after President Biden announced plans for America's complete military withdrawal from Afghanistan. I hope they have the means to get out before the Taliban take over again, as sooner or later will most likely happen. The United States did not go into Afghanistan after 9/11 to improve the status of women. We did so anyway. Millions of girls whom the Taliban had forbidden to get any kind of education went to school. Some of them, not nearly enough, but impressive considering where they started from and the challenges they faced, became doctors, entrepreneurs, members of parliament. A few got to watch their daughters play soccer under the protective shield of Pax Americana, American peace. Those women are now being abandoned. So is every Afghan who struggled to make the country a more humane, hospitable, ethnically and socially tolerant place. Some by taking immense personal risks to help U.S. troops, diplomats, and aid workers do their jobs. As George Packer writes in The Atlantic, there are some 17,000 such Afghans waiting for the wheels of U.S. bureaucracy to turn so they can get their visas. If Joe Biden wants to distinguish his immigration policy from that of his predecessor, he should sign an executive order to grant every one of those visa applications. Quickly, it would lift the death sentence that now lies on their heads. It would be in the best American tradition of welcoming political refugees from places like Hungary, Cuba, Vietnam, the Soviet Union, and northern Iraq. And it would send the useful signal that helping America when America asks isn't the dumbest thing a person can do. But those 17,000 are still a tiny fraction of who we are leaving behind. There's a rational argument to be made that the United States went into Afghanistan to serve our national interests, coldly considered, and not the needs of an impoverished country of nearly 40 million people. Foreign policy is ultimately about self-interest, not the interests of others. But what was the American interest in staying in Afghanistan beyond the fall of the Taliban? It wasn't centrally to kill Osama bin Laden, who was just one in a succession of terrorist masterminds. It was to prove bin Laden wrong about America's long-term commitments, especially overseas. So he goes into talking about 9/11 and Obama. So basically, the point of the article, let me just read these last two paragraphs. There's a view that to ask Afghans to fend for themselves after 20 years of American sacrifice shouldn't be seen as unreasonable. But foreign policy is also about dealing with the world as it is, not as we wish it would be. In the wished-for world, Afghan leaders wouldn't be inept. Afghan women wouldn't be in increased peril. The Taliban would have severed their links to international terrorists. And what the U.S. did in one corner of the world would have no bearing on how it's seen elsewhere. In the world as it is, none of that is true. And we have to find a way of advancing our interests without betraying our values and our friends. Last week's calamitous decision on Afghanistan fails that test on every front. So this is Brett L. Stevens, also, by the way, if you're interested, previously editor-in-chief of our favorite publication, the Jerusalem Post. Very interesting. Your reaction, Mohsin, to this horrible article?
Well, I'd first of all pick up on this issue of women, and it's always an interesting one to analyze, because first of all, of course, to go in and rape resources of another nation and to inflict kind of civilian damage and death to ordinary people and to destroy the kind of the infrastructure of a nation ultimately needs some kind of justification for your own citizenry. Now, the American citizenry work on emotion. They, by and large, I don't see that they're politically that astute or are particularly clued up about foreign policy in particular. You could arguably sell them anything, so long as you got them emotionally involved in a narrative. Now, the one they used in Afghanistan, of course, was the emotional narrative of the Twin Towers and the coming down of the bombing. So it was a no-brainer to be able to keep the American public on side with that whole revenge, and we're going to go and clear the world up of terrorists, and the Afghans happen to be harboring the nastiest ones. So of course it was a free ride for the American administration initially to come in and get on with all this. Part and parcel with that, just for good measure, of course, the words democracy are always thrown around. That was usually the first thing that is added to the masala of why they should go and invade other countries. It's got to be part of the menu, part of the dish, part of the cooking process. Is definitely there's a vital ingredient called democracy, and there's a vital ingredient called human rights, and there's a vital ingredient called terrorists. All this is all sexy language and very great for PR sales, for justifying why American soldiers are going to be losing their lives. You've got to have a good reason why your kid's going to get killed in a land where they weren't born and don't have any connections. So they use these three major tools, standard really, wherever they go, whether it's Libya or whether it's they want to invade Syria or they want to invade Iraq. Time and time again, these images of a nasty heathen, dictator, Islamist are thrown up in order to justify their own heinous crimes. But of course, the women one is a real, it's a real sort of heartstring puller, isn't it? I mean, who can argue against the equality of women? Of course, we're all into giving equal rights to women, but the problem is that first of all, when you go and impose what I describe as neoliberal narratives, which are all part of the Agenda 2030, the United Nations rolling out these so-called sustainable initiatives. One of the major ones is all about gender, and it's about equality. I'm all for equity. Equality is a nonsense. There is no equality. None of your fingers are the same. None of your fingerprints are the same. You can't have equality amongst men. You don't have equality amongst white males, whether they're supremacists or otherwise, who dominate most of Western society even today. The fact is that equality is a dream. It's a pipe dream that we all can sign on to, but we've been sold it at the expense of equity, which is far more sensible and reasonable. I think the women's movement and the feminist movement generally in the West has been hijacked and used as part of a political tool for hoodwinking not only women but also the general society, that the intentions of this global elitist money mafia backed American crusade to make everybody become civilized. The women have been used. This is again a major tool. You cannot go into cultures and civilizations which have been around for thousands of years, which do have some practices which are not acceptable by any virtue ethic, not by an Islamic virtue ethic, let alone the self-praised neoliberal neocon values, which I find rather questionable if we look at the track record of just how much murdering, maiming, and killing and looting that they do. To put in the women's issue is quite diabolical. It's just a use of a term in order to just tick more boxes to say they're the good guys. So I don't buy this liberation of women. I mean, first of all, the way they spent their money, $24 billion was supposed to go on economic development, but that didn't improve the economy. The poverty in Afghanistan is worse than it was when they arrived. The status of women, yes, in the inner cities, women do have opportunities and they are being given certain rights, but they're also of a certain class. They're of a wealthy class. I mean, it's not as though the Americans, while they were there and with the current government, are giving total blanket equality or equity to women. It's been very selective, and it's a certain middle class elitist fraternity that primarily may have benefited. But overall, a quarter or more of Afghans are unemployed more broadly, beyond these kind of little false flag narratives we get thrown out about human rights. On the ground reality is that the economic gains, what little there were, trailed off since 2015 when the international military presence began to draw down. So, all of the money they gave, I think there was $87 billion of the aid that the Americans pumped in was all to their own contractors, training the Afghan military and the police. What kind of training they were giving them is rather laughable, given that the collapse of that infrastructure, of that very Afghan military over the last 3 or 4 weeks, you've witnessed as soon as the Americans have apparently started withdrawing, those very security forces that they were training have collapsed and turned tail and run. Where's that $87 billion gone? It's gone into the pockets of contractors who've essentially ripped off, done a completely pathetic job at training those forces, those people that they even said was theirs. Beyond all of this, you can see that it's been an entire exercise in absolute futility, economically, culturally, politically, socially, on any level, on any measure. If you were to rank the achievements of America in Afghanistan, you would have to say it's an outright failure. I'll address. I'm not sure whether I addressed your exact question totally there.
Yeah. No, that was.
That was
really
issue. Was what I picked up from that article, and I think I've managed to give my personal opinion on that.
That's a great breakdown. And Leslie says the U.S. feminist movement was all about women having a seat at the capitalist and imperialist table. Well said. And I think another point that I'm glad you touched on is the financial impact, because one of the things that a lot of the neoliberal economists want is more people in debt. They want as many people sucked in and playing into their financial schemes so that they can get more people in debt. Because when you're in debt, you're controllable. So one thing that I find really interesting is that a large part of the private sector that has supported U.S. occupation in Afghanistan have been participating in what they call entrepreneurship and women's micro businesses. So you'll have these companies that will issue loans to women in Afghanistan to start their own businesses so they can get into debt so that banks can control people there more. And I feel like that's kind of the masquerade, right? They're masquerading it as women's liberation and empowerment. But at the end of the day, they just want more bodies. They want more bodies to be in debt, to be controlled, because that's how you control people in a country. Get them into debt, get them subjugated to the neoliberal economic scheme, have them play into that and control them. And I think having that economic viewpoint is so crucial. And again, it goes into as well, one thing that I highly respect about Islamic faith and culture is the opposition to debt, the opposition to worshiping the free market, worshiping the dollar, worshiping money, and living according to your means, humility. And I think it's something that in Afghanistan the people have maintained and preserved, and they don't want Western neoliberal economics and debt and banks and all these corporations to be in their country. They want to preserve their way of life, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I think people in the West have to understand that. People don't want to get into those schemes. But just kind of wrapping up here, it's been really great speaking with you so far. In the last few minutes that we have, I wanted to read this tweet by Ben Shapiro, another Zionist, hardcore pro-Israel speaker. He put out this tweet after the announcement of Biden. He said, every Biden foreign policy decision is now condition independent. He's willing to concede to Iran and China regardless of what they do too, regardless of what you think of his Afghanistan policy. And I don't like it. Making foreign policy independent of conditions is nuts. So the subtle clue here, the subtle thing that is important, because the narrative is going to shift now, right? Now that the Zionists know that their spells and narratives about staying in Afghanistan no longer work, the people are more awakened to that fact. Now the narrative is going to be Iran and China are spreading their influence, right? Because as you were talking, as you were mentioning earlier, the Taliban are more open to trading with China and Iran and negotiating with Pakistan as well. So now it's going to be Iranian proxies, Chinese proxies, Russian proxies. What do you see in the next few years looking forward? What are some of the challenges facing Afghanistan now that the U.S. is withdrawing? What do you think obviously we can't predict the future, but what do you foresee are some of the new challenges, and how do you think the U.S. empire is going to pivot, right? Are they going to now focus more on Western China with Xinjiang? Are they going to, try to use the whole proxies in kind of like what they did in Iraq, how they've been bombing Iraq because they claim quote unquote Iranian proxies? Where do you see this going moving forward?
Well, I think that, first of all, if the internal situation of Afghanistan is resolved without a huge sort of civil war, what I'd see is a Taliban-dominated establishment emerging, whether it's through military victory, outright victory, or whether it's through rapprochement and through the regional powers getting together and creating stability in Afghanistan with promises of financial support, infrastructural building, Belt Road Initiative. I see the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, and the Pakistanis playing a major role in creating a stabilizing effect in Afghanistan. I think that's the most likely factor, with the Americans perhaps being an inconvenience through their ISIS proxies, continuing to create terrorist acts and trying to destabilize the country. I see neoliberal banksters perhaps trying to use maybe even some of their charms through Russia and perhaps even China to still get their foot in the door in Afghanistan. I'd like to see what the central bank is all about, because don't forget, the Americans took down 7 countries, all of whom weren't linked to the Bank of International Settlements at the beginning of this century. Afghanistan was one of those. Iran was one of those. Iraq was one of those. Most of them, Libya was one of those. Most of those have now gone down. There's only Iran left, and I think that Afghanistan has also been neoliberalized. So you've got to look at the banksters and see what they're up to and what their game is in this. It's not just about the geopolitical players and the states themselves. So in the background, what they do will impact what the World Bank, what the Bank of International Settlements, what all of that fraternity will do in terms of cooperating and making money out of Afghanistan. They don't care whether they make money via Russian, Iranian, or Eurasian, if you like, bodies, or whether it's American Zionist imperialist bodies. Some would even argue that the tentacles of the Zionists and the influence of the Zionists exists within the lobby groups or the corridors of power of perhaps even China and Russia on one level or another. And so perhaps they could stop backing the losing horse, which is the US military complex and its tentacles, and perhaps start doing more business with the Chinese and with the Russians and with the rise of this Eastern economic power bloc, Iran even. That is certainly an option on the table. It all really depends on what the deals are, what happens economically in the background. And I would have thought that the Taliban and the Afghans generally would want peace and would want to stabilize and would be tired of the bloodshed and the warfare. They would grab with with open arms the opportunity for peace. The only threat to that would be a dying American imperialist Zionist empire, which might not facilitate it happening. America is still going to suffer from this war. They're not. I mean, that $500 billion on interest is what American citizens are going to continue paying for the money that they borrowed to carry out this war. That's just a fact. I mean, the loans that they picked up will still be paid until 2023, and the facts I have are $500 billion. I think is the total that they've got to pay out. All of this economic debt, all of this kind of baggage, will definitely make it harder for them to perhaps convince future American citizens to go back into Afghanistan formally. But as you rightly said right at the beginning of the program, they don't need to. They can keep proxy forces and try to keep threatening everybody to at least still have some of the economic pie and the goodies that might come out of Afghanistan in the future. I guess that's what it's ultimately all about. It's all about the money and whether they're willing to settle for a more reasonable cut. Whether the Taliban and company go for a resistance economy, which would be my preference, which they'd say bye-bye to all of the neoliberal infrastructures or finance. They wouldn't buy into the Bank of International Settlements. They wouldn't do the whole central bankster thing. If they know, well, they're better off making great ties with Iran, Pakistan, and such like neighbors, and creating a resistance economy and to resist the temptation of being embroiled in debt, which they'll never be able to pay. They're already in debt, but they certainly have enough resources if they were to be able to get the right infrastructures and the partnerships going with China and such like more advanced technological nations to start reaping the rewards of some of the benefits and the natural resources that Afghanistan holds. That's what we pray for, is a peaceful Afghanistan. I think our memory about the great game in Afghanistan is something which doesn't last so long with those who want to use Afghanistan and to play the great game. I can't guarantee that temptation won't still be there for regional and international powers.
That's a great recap, summing up what's going on in Afghanistan. And I agree, hopefully they do have a resistance economy model where they don't succumb to international capitalism, to globalism, to neoliberalism. And I'm confident that the people of Afghanistan will move forward in a progressive direction with Iran, with China, with Russia, trading with other countries, Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think I'm optimistic because I see this as an awakening of the world to US occupation, to US imperialism. understanding that the powers of Zionism, imperialism, Israel, and the US are getting weaker and weaker by the day. And I'm truly confident of that. Even in Latin America, in Peru, there was an indigenous leftist president who was just elected and is now trying to cut ties with the US, trying to trade more with Iran, with China. And Peru historically has been a very right-wing conservative country. Uprisings in some of the right-wing colonies of the US and Israel, a renewed shift to the left in Latin America, anti-imperialism, trading with the anti-imperialist resistance, and Pakistan, seeing Pakistan move away from being a US colony, having an independent foreign policy. That's also very inspiring as well. And I hope India, hopefully someday, can take that path. But I'm optimistic. I think the world is opening its eyes to the evils of Wall Street, of the London Stock Exchange, of this financial system that has pillaged, terrorized millions of people around the world with wars. And I think Afghanistan is on that path. But on that note, Mohsin, it was really great speaking with you once again. Mohsin is an independent TV journalist, broadcaster, current affairs analyst. He's also on Press TV. Make sure to go and show some love to Press TV. They have been under attack so much. I also do some commentary on Press TV from time to time. And it's one of the few TV networks out there that actually has the voices of people like us who oppose the empire, expose imperialism and Zionism. And it's important to support them, but also please support Mohsin's work. And it's been really great talking to you, man. I hope to have you back on soon, and I hope all is well with you, man. Thank you so much, and take care.
It's one of my favorite times to discuss these things so openly, and thank you for the opportunity. Bless you.
Of course, brother. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.